Thanks to all for coming. Good to see you all again. We always get some attrition after the first couple of sessions, and that's to be expected. We'll have a good show today, a rather interesting number of characters we will discuss. Please forgive me if I sit down during most of the session. My legs are not what they used to be. But bear with me, we'll make it worth your while. Last week, we discussed the history of the Vice Presidency and began with Charles Curtis, that was Vice President in the 1920s and early 30s under Herbert Hoover. The interesting things about Mr. Curtis, amongst many, was the fact that he was 3/8 Native American. In the past, it was said American Indian, but the politically correct way is Native American. And that he favored, very enthusiastic, for all minorities, including Native Americans, education and assimilation. Nowadays, 100 years later, our society is into DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, which is somewhat different, actually quite different from assimilation and education. Who is right, who is wrong? That's history. All right, so we're not going to judge one or the other, but just to point out how the pendulum has swung significantly between those two extremes. Last week, we discussed the major characteristics of the process of assimilation. And we don't have time to review those in person, but please read up on the...
Just last night on PBS, on the PBS News, there was a piece about Native American schools and the abuse of the Catholic Church.
Right.
So we're very timely.
Yeah, this is a subject that keeps coming back over and over and over again, and children get to study that in school sometimes, and they will ask you questions, your grandchildren, about what happened to the Native Americans, to the American Indians, that they ended up where they are right now. Then after that, we went back to discuss the major efforts government made to bring in not only Native Americans, but also African Americans, but also Oriental Americans and many others into the mainstream of American society. That was the world in which Charles Curtis grew up. As a legislator, Mr. Curtis was appointed to the Senate in 1907. Please remember that up until 1913, senators were appointed by the state legislatures. They were not elected by the people. They were appointed by the legislatures. And that was an agreement or a compromise at the Constitutional Convention of 1787. The House is elected by the people. The House responds to the people. The Senate responds to the state's legislatures. Two totally different interests. The people, the large states have the power there. The legislatures, all states have equal influence. That's the compromise that we have. And up until that time, 1913, the senators were appointed. So Curtis was first appointed and then elected to the Senate, where he served for 15 years. He was quite a senior member of the Senate. He was a distinguished member of the Senate. He was respected and liked by his colleagues. They would have a conference, for example, and people would go to the conference expecting to see this Indian chief with feathers and whatnot. And they found this suave, sophisticated, educated man who went around shaking hands, introducing himself, being very gracious and very learned. And this, he recognized, was all a product of his education. Education was the process by which minorities would rise in American society, according to Mr. Curtis. In 1923, he proposed the first version of the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment, which we will discuss next week in some detail. But the ERA was originally the idea of Charles Curtis and his associates, that all rights and privileges would be the same between the sexes. That women would have the same rights and privileges and responsibilities. That's what really killed the ERA. The concept that women would have to have the same responsibilities as men. Generally, he was recognized as a walking political encyclopedia. He kept a file of people he met. Today, I met Joe Blow. He is from this story. He's still on everybody he met. And that way, he could always reference back. What am I going to meet today, Joe Blow? Oh, yeah, I remember him. Hey, Mr. Joe Blow, how's your family? How's that farm in Kansas? He had that ability as a politician to be able to ingratiate himself easily in others. You remember, maybe, maybe not, the comments that some of the vice presidents said about the vice presidency. Not worth a bucket of warm piss and things like that. Mr. Curtis enjoyed being vice president. He really enjoyed the ceremonial aspects of the vice presidency. He enjoyed meeting people in his office. He enjoyed receiving delegations from his constituents. He enjoyed going out and he opened up the 1932 Olympics in California. He enjoyed being photographed and being seen and putting on the headgear and meeting with the other Indian chiefs. He absolutely enjoyed it.
Did he have aspirations to run for president?
Of course he did. All of these presidents in the 20th century wanted to be president. But yes, he certainly did. And he had lots of artifacts in his office. One problem he had, though, he could not find a house in Washington. You wonder why. No, you don't. We don't wonder why. Because we know that at that time, Washington, D.C. was a very, very segregated place. Particularly three minorities: blacks, Indians, Native Americans, and Jews. Hotels were segregated. People would come in under a different name. They were immediately spotted. They would say, "We're sorry, your reservation was canceled. We'll get you a hotel room in such and such a place, but this place is..." That was known in Washington, D.C. Washington was, the core of Washington was closed to Jews, Native Americans, and blacks. He did stay in a suite of rooms, I think, at the Mayflower. Mayflower was integrated at that time, and that's what where he stayed. But he did not have a house. He was a single man. He was a widower. His wife had died, and the person that was his hostess was his sister-in-law. His sister, I think. His sister was the hostess or the second hostess. But he really enjoyed the social and the ceremonial aspects of the vice presidency. There were two things that really destroyed his tenure in office. The Great Depression, that would have destroyed anybody's tenure in office, and the Bonus Army incident, which we will discuss. The Great Depression began in the United States and showed how consumer confidence, all right, there we go. Consumer confidence affected markets. In the late 1920s, consumer confidence was not a concept. It was somewhat recognized, but it was not fully understood how important it is to have consumer confidence so that people continue to buy things that are produced, and in the production people have jobs and so forth and so on. It was kind of recognized, but really not fully understood. There were a lot of shady schemes and margin sales. Like in Florida, they were selling real estate waterfront. They tell you that the water was really small. Or there is oil in this property in Oklahoma. Well, there had been an oil spill, and that's how the property had oil, because of the spill. Nothing could grow there. The other thing was margin sales. Do we know what a margin sale is? We do. Okay, so let's summarize it rapidly and simply. This is a simplification. This was a time when value of stock holdings or equity was growing rapidly. That's the key thing to understand. That if you bought, say, 100 shares of a company, it was due to increase in value over a short period of time. And brokerage companies were willing to give you, or make you money, give you loans on the value of your shares. Suppose you bought 100 shares of a stock at $1. In a few months, it would be worth $200. So the brokerage company would be glad to sell you more stock on your profit that has not been realized. Only 10% you have to put down. That's buying on margin. So you get more stock from another company, say, for 10% only. Now, it's a loan. The brokerage lends you the money. So the brokerage makes money on the interest that it charges, which it takes off your original investment. In other words, it's very, very shady. Margin accounts still exist. They do exist, but you have to have collateral. You have to have good collateral. I know once, about 20 years ago, I had a margin account, and the market kind of went down a little bit. My broker was on the phone immediately. You have to do something about that today. Okay, so we did something about that day. So that was the deal about margin accounts. Everybody was in the stock market. And it was really a bubble, a super bubble, based on what? goodwill speculation. Is that concept somewhat clear, how people were buying things with money that they really did not have? It was all up in the cloud.
They don't invest like that today. The saying on the stock market is, if you buy a stock, it goes up, you sell it. If it doesn't go up, you don't buy.
Correct, thank you very much. So you get the idea that it was a very, very unrealistic market. People were buying shares and investing in companies with money that really did not, wealth that really did not exist, except in their imagination. So the Federal Reserve Bank, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, really mishandled the bubble. You've seen how the Federal Reserve Bank, the last few years, have been increasing the interest rates little by little, little by little, little by little. At that time, the Federal Reserve Bank pulled back by a big deal, really slammed the brakes. And by increasing the interest rates too much, too fast, it really shortened or really decreased the amount of money available. We'll stop by this subject in a moment. The gold standard we will discuss, as well as the smooth falling act about the tariffs. So the Great Depression began in the US of A and spread worldwide. For those of you who were unfortunate enough to take the class on fascism, do you remember which country in Europe really did not experience much of a depression? Italy. Italy under Mussolini really did not experience much of a depression. The way that industry was controlled by the government. In other words, what FDR with the New Deal did in the United States, that is bringing in industry under the control of government, the fascists and Mussolini were doing for 10 years before they did. That way, the Great Depression in Italy was really not as severe as it was in the United States or Canada or Nazi Germany. They suffered a lot in Nazi Germany. Hitler probably would never become prime minister or chancellor had it not been for the Great Depression. So it was a really severe downturn, declining production, deflation, mass unemployment, which was variable. Overall, it reached about 25%. In some places, however, unemployment was close to 90%. But overall, the whole nation, it was around 25% at its worst, which is pretty bad. But in some cities or towns where they had one or two big industries and nothing else, the depression hit very, very hard. And a lot of people were unemployed. There were 4 banking panic waves. 1929, 2 in 1930, 1 in 1931, where people rushed the banks looking for their money, and the banks just did not have the money to pay them back. There was a lot of poverty and homelessness. The gold standard is said to have contributed to the depression. Gold standard exists when the currency is pegged to the value of gold. Gold costs so much by fiat or by rule or by law, and that limits the flexibility of central banks to adjust to these. Specifically, it does not help people with small industries who need loans in order to keep on going. They need money to operate, to produce things that they can sell. With the gold standard, if the central bank does not have gold on hand, it cannot issue paper money. It cannot lend any money that it does not have. So the gold standard in the USA was around for a long time, and it certainly aided the Depression when businesses could not borrow the money they needed for day-to-day operations. What did the Hoover administration do? Very little. They were Republicans, and they were conservative Republicans. At that time, the Republican Party was a very, very conservative party.
Maybe not that time.
So sorry?
He said, what do you mean at that time?
Yeah. 100 years
Well,
ago.
the Republican Party way before that was very different.
Much, much more.
More than today.
They felt that the government had absolutely no business interfering with business. Absolutely not. They felt that if these were hard times, why people were out of work, they didn't have to eat, they didn't have any money to do, the churches should take care of that. Community groups should take care of that. Municipalities should take care of that. The YMCA should take care of that. All these community organizations should address those issues. Not the government.
Right.
Not the government. That was the general mentality. So they did nothing. Absolutely nothing until 1932, when they came up with the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, the RFC up here. Made loans to banks, railroad, mortgage association to boost confidence. Note that the RFC stayed on until 1957. So the RFC did some good work, some, too little, too late. But it did, they were on the right track at that time. There was also a Revenue Act, which was a disaster, and the Agricultural Marketing Act. They also had some other legislation, including the Glass-Steagall Act of 1932. That was towards the end of their term. So the Hoover administration did really very, very little, and when they did something, it was just too late. They already had two black eyes, and they could not get out of the hole. Mr. Curtis, who was Vice President, did say, quote, "Good times are just around the corner." He did say that. He did. But it was attributed by the press to Hoover. And then that gave Hoover yet more bad publicity. But the author of that phrase was Mr. Curtis in his office in the Capitol. He was unsympathetic to the bonus army, which we need to discuss. The bonus began in 1776 during the Revolution. And the idea was to compensate men who were the ones that went into the army at that time for the money that they would not earn because they had enrolled in the army. A man, say, would earn $600 a year working his farm. He joined the army. The army would pay him $500. The balance was $100. The bonus was that $100 difference between what he would have earned and what he actually earned in the army. That was the idea. So after the First World War, government authorized the payment of $1 a day for domestic service and $1.25 for overseas service, up to $500 and $625, which at that time was considerable. Multiply that by 30, and you get an idea of how much money that is in today's day and age. About $15,000, close to $20,000 for the other. So it was not a negligible account. So certificates of service were issued, almost 4 million of them, but they would mature in 1945. They would have no value until 1945. So the bonus army was a group of 45 or so thousand veterans who came to Washington in the summer of 1932, together with their families, together with others. They camped in Washington on both federal and private properties and petitioned the government. Look, government, give us our bonus now. We understand it's 10 years or more earlier. We are not supposed to get this bonus until 10 years or so from now, but we need it now. Find the money somehow. Borrow the money. Go to China and borrow more money from China. They do it anyway nowadays. So what happened? The government responded. The House of Representatives considered the Wright-Patman bill and approved it, 211 to 176, about 35 votes difference. But the House approved it. And then it went to the Senate. Well, it really failed miserably in the Senate, 18 to 62. And there were several thousand veterans outside the Capitol building waiting for this to be approved. Because for many, it was the difference between survival and not survival. When word came out that the Senate had not approved it, some people went home, some people stayed put, some people from the outside came in. They were agitated, and eventually riots broke out. Fires were set. You can see the Capitol here in the upper right-hand corner. This is the Capitol up here. You can see the dome. So this was a riot, no question about it. The federal government decided that it had jurisdiction over Washington, D.C., particularly federal land, and instead of consulting with the D.C. police, they called in the troops. Our friend Patrick, George C., brought in 5 tanks, and they crossed the Anacostia and wiped out the camps there. Let's see if you recognize, all right?
That book.
Do you recognize these 2 gentlemen? That's Eisenhower on the right. In the middle,
Douglas MacArthur.
MacArthur. MacArthur was chief of staff of the Army, and Eisenhower at that time, I'm not sure whether he was a general yet. He may have been I don't know, something. He was his aide, his major aide to MacArthur. And they were there in Washington, D.C. as the tanks overran the camps and disbanded the bonus army. The bonus army, the camps, were very, very different from the Poor People's Campaign that we remember from the 60s. Remember that the Bonus Army were soldiers. They were used to camping and living in tents. So the tents that they set up in Washington, D.C. were very, very organized. There were avenues, streets, there were addresses, they accounted for latrines, they accounted for garbage removal, they accounted for places to eat. It was as organized as it could be. Why? Because these were men who had done it before, both in Europe and in the States. Living out in the field, it was second nature to them. So it did not create a public hazard until the riots took place. If they had consulted the DC police, for example, things could have been managed totally different. But the federal government acted unilaterally in overcoming the Bonus Army. Of course, the publicity was terrible. And after the Depression, the no reaction to the Depression and the Bonus Army fights, the administration of Herbert Hoover really had no future. They, of course, lost the election, even though Curtis was renominated for vice president. And he stayed in Washington. He had a lot of contacts. He knew everybody. And he did not lack for work as a consultant. He eventually died suddenly of a coronary in 1936. That's the story of Charles Curtis. He was the first individual to become vice president who did not have a purely European background. And he was a believer in assimilation and education. After Mr. Curtis, John Nance Garner was elected together with Franklin Roosevelt in 1932 and began or took office in 1933. Garner was the 32nd Vice President of the United States, and more different people could not have existed. Garner was born in Texas. Garner was or grew up in Texas. Garner attended Vanderbilt University in Tennessee for about a month. And then he went back to Texas, and at that time, attorneys apprenticed with a established attorney who certified that they were ready to take the bar exam, went to Austin, took the bar exam, and then was accepted as an attorney. So there were not that many law schools at that time. There was, of course, the Ivy League schools had law schools, but very, very few attorneys actually went to law school at that time. Lincoln, for example, never did. He did the same thing. He apprenticed, he read the law, he studied until he took a review course and then took that bar exam. So after passing the bar, he practiced in Uvalde, the scene of very unfortunate events in our lifetime. In other words, this was the Texas man all the way. Born in Texas, educated in Texas, practiced in Texas. And this thing must work in Texas.
I just didn't like that, honestly, but just turned it off.
I don't know. You got the touch. Thank you so much. All right, so he was the county judge and in Uvalde, and then was elected to the Texas House and to the U.S. House in 1903. He was elected and re-elected 15 times from the same district, which he himself helped to draw. And we'll show you a sketch of that district in a moment. And he was the Speaker of the House for some of those years. So Mr. Gardner was really not an unknown politician. He was really a senior politician, well-known, well-liked. When he first went to the Texas legislature, there was a debate about the Texas state flower. So he was in favor of the prickly pear cactus being the state flower. So therefore, he was always known as Cactus Jack. In history, he's still known as Cactus Jack. One of his more infamous things was he voted for a poll tax. And history books consistently have it written down that Cactus Jack voted for a poll tax. Do we all understand what a poll tax is? A poll tax is a head tax. That is, everybody pays that tax. You pay that tax, I pay that tax, he pays that tax. It doesn't matter whether you work at a school, whether you work at the shop, or whether you drive a van, everybody pays the same thing. It makes no distinctions. Everybody pays a poll tax. And this is one of the oldest taxes in civilization. Even in our lifetime, remember Margaret Thatcher in the UK? Margaret Thatcher put on a poll tax, which was very, very unpopular. And eventually it had to be withdrawn. But it is one of the oldest forms of taxation, the poll tax, in which everybody, absolutely everybody, gets taxed the same amount for all services around in the county or in the state. In that sense, it is very, very fair. In the South, after Reconstruction, the poll tax was used to prevent certain individuals, mostly former slaves, from voting. Why? Because they just did not have the money to pay for the poll tax. And even if they had the money, they had to go to a police station to pay the tax. And at the police station, they would say, they would face an individual who would say, where did you get the money to pay for this poll tax? Oh, you don't remember. So who would want to go to a police station and be questioned like that? It was a way of intimidating former slaves into not voting. But otherwise, it was very, very egalitarian in the sense that everybody is charged the same amount of money for all services, including.
But that's sort of regressive, isn't it? For the rich man, it's easy to pay those few dollars, whatever. But for some of those, particularly former slaves, or there were poor white that just didn't have money.
Or even Scarlett O'Hara.
Yeah.
Yeah, one of the problems Scarlett O'Hara had was that she did not have the money to pay taxes, including the poll tax at that time in the book. And this is why she turned over to Red Butler, who had made his money from all the cotton that he had in stores in England. Yeah, so it affected everybody. In that case, the taxes, a poll tax is very, very fair to everybody who has the money.
Yeah, that's a misstatement. It's not fair. It's very regressive. It penalizes poor. That makes it unfair.
That's the idea.
In some places, the poll taxes were not that onerous. Look at this, the state of Louisiana, parish of Jefferson, 1917, poll tax is $1. $1. Now, somebody who is really broke, $1 is a lot of money, right? All right? But $1 is certainly not perceived as being necessarily onerous. So it varies from one place to another. It can be really, really heavy, or it can be minimal. And this poll tax was specifically for public schools. All right, so we discussed poll taxes. This is a map of the Texas 15th Congressional District.
Yeah.
When did gerrymandering start?
I was gonna say, gee,
That was there a long time before. So you can see how forced that district is. It was really chosen in order to benefit some people and not the others. This is all over the South. This is an important slide. I'm glad you got a laugh out of that. Clear your cobwebs so that you can, this concept can sink in and you can leave this session with something. Being in the U.S. House, John Nance Garner was a conservative Southern Democrat. That's the thing to remember. Conservative Southern Democrat. As such, he was in favor of small government. He was in favor of fiscal responsibility. He was in favor of balanced budgets. He was in favor of state sovereignty versus federal sovereignty, which is a problem we still face nowadays. Hardly a day goes by when the state government and the federal government are fighting each other. The last thing is, of course, abortion. When both state governments and federal governments are trying to establish who has jurisprudence over the abortion matters. John Nance Garner was also for owners and against unions and strikes. He was allied to the white landowners because they control the voting booths in Texas. That way he got elected and reelected and reelected and reelected. So the key thing to remember is that Garner was at this time a conservative Southern politician. Okay, did we get that point? Did we make that point? Good. All right, back to the cobwebs. Let's, after being in the House for so many years and being Speaker of the House, Garner wanted to be president in 1932. So he went to the convention and he very promptly realized that FDR had enough candidates, enough delegates to get nominated. So he sent word over to the Roosevelt camp, said, hey guys, I'll be glad to let my delegates vote for FDR. Do you have a candidate for vice president yet? So he was offered the position of vice president. At that time, let's make this clear, the president did not choose his vice president. At that time, the convention chose the vice president. Lincoln had expressed a desire to have Andrew Johnson as his vice president. He had just expressed a desire, but he had not given the command. It's not like nowadays that the presidential candidate appoints the vice presidential candidate. It was open to discussion and to voting at the convention. All right, so John Nance Garner gets elected with FDR, and FDR begins all of these New Deal proposals to get the country out of the Depression. Remember what he was for. He was for small government, fiscal responsibility, balanced budget, state sovereignty, on and on and on. Everything that FDR was destroying or cutting down. The key thing to understand at this time is that John Nance Garner realized that these measures, which he was against, were temporary. This is just to get the country out of the Depression. This is only temporary. This is not going to last. For that reason, I'll go along with that. All right? That's the other key thing to remember. That John Nance Garner realized that these were critical times for the country, and critical times needed critical initiatives. But for him, his understanding was that they were always temporary. These would eventually be rescinded or taken away. That way we can understand John Nance Garner. Once the Depression went away, once business came back, then all of these New Deal issues would be taken back.
But Roosevelt was also kind of drawn into the New Deal by John Maynard Keynes, slowly, so it wasn't quite as dramatic at the beginning, I guess.
No, you are very correct. There were many other influences on the management of the Great Depression and the New Deal. But we're trying to simplify things so that we can all remember what this was all about. As we said before, the economy was vulnerable to shifts in confidence, which was not recognized as a force at that time. The shady schemes had ended up in disaster for the speculators, and the federal government had not responded favorably. Many countries were competing for the same markets, and there was very little cooperation between the markets. We mentioned the shady real estate deals and the securities bought on margin, and also the bank failures. The Federal Reserve System was created way back before the First World War to make sure that the money supply was stable. By increasing or decreasing interest rates, the money supply, the amount of money circulating, was controlled by the government. During the 1920s, the amount of money increased almost 70%. And that resulted in lower interest rates and a bubble, over investing. When the federal government put the brakes on the bubble by increasing federal interest rates, then the damage had been done. And banks just did not have the cash with which to satisfy their needs. We talked about the gold standard, and again, the thing to remember about the gold standard is whenever the gold standard exists, banks do not have the flexibility to issue loans to people who need loans in order to maintain their businesses. Many businesses depend on loans to make sure that they produce the things they make, They go to market, they get sold, money comes back, they pay the bank, they borrow more money for the next year, on and on and on and on. This was also a major problem, the Smoot-Hawley Act. This was initiated before the Depression. It was at a time when there was a bubble. There was a lot of money. Bank accounts and stock holding accounts were increasing on a regular basis. So the government went ahead and increased tariffs by 16%. A tariff is, of course, the tax put on goods that are exported from other countries. What did the other countries do? The same thing. They said, oh, you put a tariff on our stuff, we'll put a tariff on your stuff. So basically, commerce between countries really slowed down. And it was a no-win, no-win situation for everybody involved. At this time, 1,000 economists went to President Hoover and said, Mr. President, please do not sign this bill. This is not going to work. This is going to do us harm. And he said, let the market take care of it. This is just government. Don't talk to me. I'm just the president. So he signed the law, and the law had very, very unfavorable results. We already talked about the Depression a little bit. Let's talk about the New Deal. Why is this important? Again, or to return to this, but your grandchildren are going to ask you about the New Deal. Because they think that we lived through the New Deal, our parents did, but we didn't. The New Deal was a series of a group of policies or legislation that really expanded the influence of government on the national economy. The philosophy of Herbert Hoover's administration was let capitalism take care of the Depression. Government is there not to control the economy. The opposite was espoused by the Democratic administration of FDR. Government has a significant role in controlling the economy. There were two waves of New Deal legislation. One in the early 30s and another one in the later 30s. The first wave tried to get relief for the unemployed, which was important, encourage recovery of the economy through federal spending and job creation. Of course, you can see how these policies were totally against what John Nance Garner believed. But he felt that they were only temporary. And finally, reform of capitalism, totally different from Hoover. Let the economy, let the free market take care of it. The second New Deal created the groundwork for today's modern social welfare, like Social Security, like Medicare, like Medicaid, like all the other endowment programs. The second New Deal stimulated consumer demand and promoted economic growth by federal deficit spending. John Nance Garner, private, personally, and politically, was against deficit spending. But he said, let's do it in order to get the country out of the Depression. Before the 1930s, the question was, should government intervene in the economy? After the 1930s, the question was, how should government intervene in the economy? The first New Deal included the Agricultural Adjustment Act, which was kind of a novel idea because it paid farmers not to grow certain crops. In other words, it was land scarcity or artificial scarcity. One of the ideas floated at that time was that the trouble with agriculture was that the farmers were growing too much grain. So if they keep the amount of grain available low, the prices will increase. Land scarcity. Of course, the Supreme Court knocked that down, but they found a way around it. So that's the idea. The CCC was very interesting, the Civilian Conservation Corps. They hired only men, paid them $1 a day to go out and work on what we call infrastructure. Digging canals and building roads and dams and this and that and something else. The interesting thing was that the CCC had to be handled by the military. Because the military had tents, military had trucks, the military had the know-how. These men were civilians. So that created some friction between the parties. And then, of course, the National Recovery Act that set wages and prices. The other measures of the New Deal included the FDIC. Legend has it that FDR Roosevelt was not in favor of the FDIC, but that John Nance Garner came from Texas one time, and Roosevelt asked him, hey, Mr. Garner, Mr. Vice President, what do the people think about the FDIC? And John Nance Garner said, Captain, that's how he always addressed Roosevelt, Captain, you need to go for this. The people will not put money back in banks unless it is insured. And he insisted on that. That's how the FDIC exists to this day. He personally did not believe that the government had any business insuring deposits or insuring banks, but he felt that this was necessary in order to have people put money back in banks. We have all heard how so-and-so lived through the Depression, and when he or she died, they found $300,000 in cash at home. Why? Because people did not trust banks. They'd rather have it at home.
My grandfather never used a bank again. He kept all his money in his house.
That's what they had.
He didn't have much, but
Whatever he had more.
he never used a bank again.
The WPA employed lots of millions in the second New Deal. The Social Security Act was part of the second New Deal, and also the Fair Labor Standards Act. Once again, we have mentioned this before, but let's review it because it's important. Mr. Garner supported the New Deal because he was convinced that these measures were temporary, that they would be terminated once the economy normalized. It did help get all these things to Congress, no doubt about it. He gave it his best. He was totally devoted to being a team player. And he always referred to the president. 1940 comes around. Like I said before, Mr. Garner wanted to run for president. But at that time, he began to disagree with Roosevelt. He disagreed with Roosevelt on the basis of his commitment to national politics, deficit spending, the power of the federal government that had been growing tremendously. Then the Flint sit-down strike that we'll review in a moment. The Judiciary Reorganization Bill that we will discuss, and the administration's effort to purge Congress of conservative Democrats like him who disagree with his policies. And this is nothing new. We have seen this in our recent past, how one administration has tried to get rid of certain Congress people, men and women, who disagree with their policies, yank them out of Congress. Roosevelt did that, and did that blatantly. He pointed out individuals. This man, that man, I don't want back in Congress. Why? Because they oppose my policies. And he did. We have seen that in our lifetime, actually quite recently. So deficit spending, it was against power of the federal government. Oh my God, this has been going on for 260 years. And the reorganization bill of the judiciary.
Deficit spending, when did we get rid of the gold standard?
When did they get rid?
When did we get rid of the gold standard?
Eventually, it was Nixon.
Yeah, it was
Really?
Nixon.
You know, with
Because
the
it
gold
limits the
standard.
money supply,
Yeah,
right?
it's
So
a-
how did they do this with the gold standard?
They eventually did. What happened in the 1960s, and this is a diversion, was that countries like France, that was at that time de Gaulle was president, would charge for things like wine and cheese and all those good things, and demand payment in US dollars. Then they would go to the treasury and say, I have here $10 billion in cash. I want gold for this. So they were really decreasing the reserves of gold and increasing the foreign reserves of gold. And that's when Nixon said, forget it. No more. We're not going to deal with gold anymore. And it was tricky. And I think it was 1968.
More like 69.
69,
I was in high school.
I remember the day when I read that in the New York Times. All the news that stood the prince. So, you see, all things that are planned don't always work out. How did this happen? God knows, but it did happen. When everybody followed their rules and regs and ended up like that. The major problem with the New Deal was really the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court was very, very conservative. Just like John Nance Garner was very conservative, was a conservative Southern Democrat. The Supreme Court was generally in that same position. So one after the other of these cases came to the Supreme Court, and they all dealt with interstate commerce, with wages, with power, and with influence. Major was this one of Schechter Poultry that really did away with the NRA until they changed the law. The same thing with paying farmers not to grow certain things. That the Supreme Court said, no. You're using tax money to pay farmers not to grow. That is wrong. So eventually that was worked out. They were taking property owned by banks and turning it over to farmers. That got turned away. And again, the Agricultural Adjustment Act was found unconstitutional. About 6 major rulings were found against the administration. So Roosevelt said, enough of this bull. let's change the courts. Again, an argument we have recently heard. What was the proposal? The president would be able to appoint one more justice for every justice over age 70, up to 6. This effort to pass the court was held in a committee for 6 months. They would not let it go through. Finally, it was sent back to the Senate. The bill was not approved, but by then, several justices had aged, had died, had retired, had gone away, and everybody was spent from the fighting. The New Deal had run its course. People were worried about war, no longer just the Depression, and the result was basically negative. Let's talk about the Flint sit-down strike, in which Nance Garner and FDR had totally different positions. In response to the Depression, GM had done well. They had cut production, laid off a whole bunch of people, decreased wages, they had slashed prices, and they had resisted the union. At that time, GM paid about $1,200 a year to each worker. This is an average. And it was felt that they needed to support a family of 4, about 14 to 1,500. So these were men, primarily in Michigan, that were underpaid, overworked, and underpaid. They decided then to go and strike the UAW in Flint, Michigan in 1936 over the New Year's holiday. They staged a different kind of strike. They did not go outside and march and decline to go in. They went into the factory, sat down, and did nothing. So it was a totally new, different kind of strike. It was a sit-down strike. Eventually, the owners and management sent in the police, but they fought them with everything they had. They threw everything they had at them: bolts, nuts, hammers, hinges, bottles, everything. A few people were hurt, but nobody was killed. At that time, the governor of Michigan, Governor Murphy, that eventually ended up on the Supreme Court, sent in the National Guard. Sent in the National Guard not to support management, but to support the strikers. That was, again, a totally different turn on the way government and private business interacted. The National Guard was sent in not to support the owners or management, but rather to protect the strike. Eventually, the strike was settled. But the problem with FDR and John Nance Garner, who wanted to run for president, John Nance Garner supported the owners, supported management, and supported finishing the strike by force. On the other hand, FDR and his administration supported the striking workers. So there was a certain degree of conflict there between the two. Eventually, in 1940, Roosevelt did not say that he wanted to run for a third term until the Democratic Convention. By then, John Nance Garner had declared that he was going to be a candidate for the presidency, assuming that FDR was not going to be the candidate. So there was more friction than between the two. Initially, FDR wanted several other people for vice president, but they did not want to become vice president. And eventually, Henry Wallace, who was then Secretary of Agriculture, was taken as vice presidential candidate. He was a supporter of the New Deal. By then, John Nance Garner had become opposed to the New Deal because the Depression had improved, the economy was bouncing back, and he was of the opinion that most of these programs should be rolled back. After the election, John Nance Garner went back to Texas, where he lived for almost 26 years, and he died just short of his age of 99. But he lived a long, long life. Very interesting man, again, who was caught in a very, very difficult and unusual position. All right, let's see how far we can get on to the next one. This is even more interesting.
So, just a quick question. So, was FDR not, it sounds like FDR wasn't particularly liked in a lot of ways.
FDR was what?
Was not particularly liked in a lot of ways in political circles.
A lot of people did not like FDR. A lot of people would not mention his name. A lot of people would refer to him as that man in the White House. He was considered by some a traitor to his cause. He was considered by some to be a socialist, which was just short of being a communist. Again, because of all his New Deal programs. Yeah, many people were really against FDR. But FDR did get the country out of the Depression.
And they loved Ellen.
I-
She could do no wrong.
I was gonna say, she got, I think, a lot of people to
They
go
don't
along with him more because of what she
No,
did.
She was in the background, and I don't think people really knew how much she was in the background.
I know she was big with the coal mining communities in Appalachia.
Right.
She really did a lot for that.
Yes, indeed. Let's talk about Henry Wallace, see how far we get. Henry Wallace was the 33rd Vice President of the US of A. He had been Secretary of Agriculture under FDR, so this is not a man who came out of nowhere. After he was Vice President, Travis, he was nominated to be Secretary of Commerce. So he served as Secretary of Commerce for 2 years after being Vice President, which is remarkable. Very few former Vice Presidents were appointed to any executive positions after. He was editor of the New Republic, not the New Republic, no, the New Republic, which was a rather leftist publication. And he ran for president in 1948 on the Progressive Party. He could not have been more different from John Nance Garner. These were two men that were totally opposite in many ways. One was born in Iowa and the other one in Texas. One went to Iowa State and had a degree in animal husbandry. I don't think they give a degree in human husbandry now, but never know. That was his degree. Nance Garner had studied law. Henry Wallace came from a family that edited a farm journal. I think it was called Wallace's Farm. And his father, even though he was a Democrat, had been Secretary of Agriculture in a Republican administration. He was interested in scientific and spiritual issues, Buddhism, Zoroastrianism, algebra, chemistry. genetics. He developed a special breed of corn by crossing strains of corn. He was so successful that after he died, the family in the 1950s sold the business to DuPont for $1 billion. That's how successful he was in crossbreeding corn and pigs and chickens. So he was more of an intellectual and a farmer. He was a man of many, many talents, including administration. Early on, he was a Democrat, then a Republican, then a progressive, while John Nance Garner was always a member of the Democratic Party. Henry Wallace, when he was elected vice president with FDR, he had never been in Congress, or he had never been elected to anything. So he went from being Secretary of Agriculture to being Vice President. Wallace's farmer, hybrid corn, and he was the one who believed that the problem with farmers were that they were growing too much grain. Therefore, if the government paid them not to grow their grain, the prices would increase because of land scarcity. Right? So under him, when the Supreme Court knocked out the AAA, he said, look, let's look at this objectively. The Supreme Court says that we should not use taxes to pay farmers not to grow. All right? Let's pay the farmers to grow green manure instead of corn. That way, the Supreme Court cannot say no. And that's how they got around the Supreme Court that time. That's what the green.
Yes, we'll say,
What is green manure?
I don't know. Not being a farmer, I do not know. But this is what all the books say. That's what they paid the farmers to produce green manure.
oh,
I suppose it's something that is recyclable. That
We'll have to look that up.
No, it's actually a crop.
yeah,
It's a plant, yeah. A green manure is a crop specifically cultivated to be incorporated into the soil while still green.
So
The green manure's biomass is incorporated with a plow or a disc, as is often done with manure. So it's,
fertilizer.
interesting.
yeah, get the nitrogen back. So kind of like when they grow the clover now, and they probably
At my
never knew that.
Very, very imaginative. So
Interesting.
Henry Wallace then gets appointed to the Department of Agriculture. And during the Depression, the Department of Agriculture grew enormous because it was one of the major problems with the Depression was agriculture. So he led a department of almost 150,000 employees with a huge budget. And he administered it very, very well. Because he was basically a farmer, he was an educated man, he had dealt with the problems that farmers have. He knew how to go about it. By the time the 1940 election came around, people were not worried about the Depression as much. People were not worried about the Reconstruction or the New Deal as much. People were worried about war in Europe coming. But this was a totally different approach. FDR, being paralyzed, did not want to go out and campaign, and he was particularly interested in the farm states. FDR wanted to keep the farm states in the Democratic hold. And for that reason, Henry Wallace was chosen to be the vice president, vice presidential candidate. In addition, and this is key to understand, he was loyal to the New Deal. While John Nance Garner was critical of the New Deal because he thought all those measures would be temporary, Henry Wallace was loyal to the New Deal and would continue that loyalty. Being vice president was not easy because vice presidents have very little to do. But Roosevelt had this bright idea. Let's make him chairman of something. So that something became a board of economic warfare. And Henry Wallace had this ability of being very earnest about himself. He showed up everywhere. He shook hands with everybody. He was very articulate. So he could give speeches without notes or without teleprompters. So the press noted it. He noticed that he was here and he was there and he was everywhere, giving speeches and shaking hands and baptizing dolls and doing all these kinds of things. And he became known as the assistant president. Why? Because he was visible. He was very visible and he was felt to be engaged with people. He was also referred to as the number 2 man in government. Very soon, this generated a lot of jealousy. So he ran into a conflict with the Secretary of State and also with the Secretary of Commerce. The end result was that the whole committee had to be disbanded, people resigned, and Henry Wallace went back to his offices with nothing to do. He ran into trouble with Cordell Hull because of a very interesting concept. At that time, one of the responsibilities of that commission was to hoard or amass strategic materials like manganese and aluminum, anticipating that there would be war. Well, Henry Wallace said, look, Mr. Secretary of State, if we are going to pay the Republic of Vietnam X amount of money for this manganese, let's make sure that that money is used for the benefit of the people. Make sure that that money doesn't go into the pockets of the businessmen or the politicians. And Cordell Hull said, no, wait, we are not going to interfere in the businesses of other countries. Sure. That was a conflict. That was a basic conflict of priorities. Another problem that he had was with Secretary of Commerce, Mr. Jesse Jesus Jones. That's how he was known as Jesse Jesus Jones, who was a conservative Democrat and very, very proud of his position. Basically, these two almost came to blows publicly in the newspapers. Mr. Wallace accused Mr. Jones of basically being incompetent, which was a major insult. So they would not talk to each other, they just spoke very ill to each other, and it was a public affair. FDR had no choice but to disband the committee, reorganize things, and restore peace. The other problem that Henry Wallace had was he gave this speech in, I think it was 1942, right during the war. In the speech, and it was in the spring of 1942, he said that the 20th century was going to be the century of the common man. and this is a quotation from that speech, that the common man must learn to increase his productivity. No nation will have the God-given right to exploit other nations. You know how well that landed in England, which was fighting for its empire at that time. Older nations will have the privilege to help younger nations. And he went so far as to say that the 20th century was going to be the century of the common man in the United Nations, in the Third World, and in Germany, Italy, and Japan, with which the United States was at war. In other words, peace will come. All wars eventually end. And at that time, we can all work together to advance the benefits and the status of men and women everywhere. Pretty revolutionary at that time. So, when the election of 1944 came around, the party elders realized, number one, Roosevelt was dying. He was very sick with hypertension, heart failure, kidney disease, and many other ailments. And Mr. Wallace was just too liberal, way too liberal. For that reason, the elders of the Democratic Party said, we can't have it. The chances are FDR is going to die soon, and whoever we nominate for vice president will eventually become president. And we do not want Henry Wallace. He had the unorthodox beliefs. He was friendly to the Soviet Union. Remember, 1944, still at war. He was critical of segregation practices. He was for integration. 10 years before it came to the Supreme Court. And he had other things. After he lost the election or the nomination, he campaigned for Roosevelt. But afterwards, even after he was appointed Secretary of Commerce, he advocated a mixed economy. A mixed economy is largely what countries like Mussolini's Italy had, Spain had, Argentina had. In the sense that the government controls and owns some industries, but some only in private hands. That is a mixed economy. Eventually, he made himself so obnoxious that he was fired by Truman. Wallace became editor of the New Republic and ran for president in 1948. As candidate for president in 1948, he was in favor of, grab this, how revolutionary, national health insurance, gender equality, desegregation of public schools, public ownership of banks or railroads, utilities, Amtrak, and to avoid war with the Soviet Union. My God, how revolutionary can you be? Of course, he could not get elected. But eventually he came around, became critical of the Soviet Union, and revised his policies, probably under threat of being hauled before Congress. He had a strange relationship with this man, Nicholas Roerich, that was some kind of guru that really defrauded the government out of a lot of money. The question that always comes up, and we can stay here and discuss this as long as you wish. What would have happened if the Democrats had not nominated as vice president in 1944, but had left Wallace in? And Wallace had become president. when Roosevelt died. Would he have dropped the atomic bombs on Japan? He was a pacifist. He may have not. Remember, Truman had been an artillery officer in the First World War. So for him, the A-bomb was just another piece of ammunition. What would the relations with the Soviet Union have been? Would there have been a Cold War? How about a space race? Wallace had advocated sharing nuclear secrets with the Soviet Union in order to harness all the energy in the nucleus. He was in favor of sharing nuclear knowledge in the Soviet Union.
So, a lot of scientists at that time had that same philosophy.
Right.
That was very, there was a lot of debate.
Very, very much.
I thought that was a way to equalize.
Right. So it was not just him
Yeah.
that was advocating these things. How about Korea? Would Korea had occurred the way it did? How about civil rights? When civil rights had taken another 10 years to materialize. How about impeachment? Could he have been impeached for being so friendly to the Soviet Union? History would have been very, very different had he ever been promoted to be president. History would have been very, very different.
Well, the statement that colonialism and imperialism should end is fascinating because all of our allies wanted to reestablish their
Absolutely.
colonies after the Second World War. I mean, what would the British say? My goodness.
Right. Now, it was certainly a thorn in the side of just about everything except the far left. And that was the reason why he was not nominated. Neither the Democrats nor the Republicans wanted him as Vice President or President.
You will have a hard time beating Dewey anyway.
I'm so sorry.
You will have a hard time beating Dewey in 48 anyway.
Oh, that's a good point.
This is-
Yeah, that would have been interesting to see if there had been a change in the presidency.
were you aware of these two men, Wallace and
No.
Garner?
March,
March of-
I heard the names, but I didn't know all this about.
The key thing to remember was John Nance Carter was a Southern conservative Democrat who thought the New Deal measures were temporary. Wallace was a farmer, an educated man, but very much of a pacifist and a left winger. So left that he was to the left of Roosevelt. And this is why he did not gain the renomination. The history would have been very, very different had he been nominated. He was a young man, he was an attractive man, he was very, very popular with people. He was his thinking was very, very advanced. Nowadays, would he have been a popular candidate?
Oh, yes.
With the liberals, yes. No, the conservatives.
All right. Well, thank you so very much for your patience. I'm sorry that we went a few minutes late. And next week, we will conclude this cycle with Mr. Spiro Agnew, Nelson Rockefeller, and a good man from Minnesota, Walter Mondale.
Spiro Agnew.
Thank you.
There.